Just a quick reminder, I'm going to be in New York City this weekend doing a reading with Ryan Wilson, Joshua Megan, Rachel Haddis, Chris Childers, and Grace Schulman at Suite, the bar SUITE in Morningside Heights, Sunday, May 19th at 3 p.m., and we will be hanging out afterwards. So come say hi. It'd be great to see you there. I'm Matthew Buckley Smith, and you're listening to SLEERICKETS. What follows is an episode that originally aired on the Secret Show feed. So if you go to SLEERICKETS.substack.com, you can sign up for a once a week supplementary podcast, the SLEERICKETS Secret Show. And I have never done this before, but after conferring with some regular subscribers, I'm releasing an early episode of The Secret Show that was a favorite of listeners. So this one was released under the title Batshit. It's about a few different things, but it is largely about the Randall Jarrell story, The Bat Poet, children's story, The Bat Poet, and the Thomas Nagel essay, What Is It Like to Be a Bat? I will just note that I'm going to include a link in the show notes to Alicia Stallings' excellent Oxford Professor of Poetry lecture on this same pair of texts. I will just note that the Secret Show episode came out long before her lecture. So I'm not saying we inspired her. I'm just saying that that sometimes that I think I'm the broken clock that's right twice a day. I think in this analogy that's my role. But this was a conversation I had with Brian. I hope you enjoy it. I certainly did, and at least some of our paid subscribers did as well. So check it out, and if you like what you hear, go to SLEERICKETS.substack.com, and you can hear a whole lot more. So I mentioned this briefly on the Secret Show, but I was thinking about this funny little article Ethan McGuire wrote. It was like a pretty smart little article about the Northman I've not seen and I don't know, but like it's in a vein of article that I always have kind of mixed feelings about, which is the like there is a crisis of masculinity in this country article, and I kind of suspect that like I'm mildly skeptical of those articles and you totally reject them is my assumption.
Well, I reject all trends. Like I don't think any
you don't think
generalities
anything is a trend?
Are true. Right. Yeah. Like I don't think anything is new or different like in any way. Like was there a pandemic or is everyone just coughing a little bit more? Like it's not that I totally reject science. I just those trend pieces, having been asked to write them a few times and trying to and failing, I just don't believe any of them are ever true. That you can find examples on both sides. That there's either a crisis of masculinity or right now we are at hypermasculinity, and both of those could be written equally well. So I don't. It's not that I reject his conclusion. It's that I reject the possibility of one coming to conclusions about crises such as a crisis of masculinity.
Is it that trends are never true, or that there are just too many people now for there to be trends?
There are too many people and there are too many simultaneous trends. There are always trends. The issue of trying to say what is the trend right now, I think you need to define your terms so narrowly that it almost becomes uninteresting or it subverts the entire enterprise.
It's like, which direction is the wind blowing?
Exactly. Because like, what is the crisis of masculinity? It's that people aren't masculine enough and that they're too masculine. It's that women are working and that men feel compelled to work. It's that you can't, support a family and a middle-class job. It's that people aren't allowed to be wife beaters anymore. Like I don't know. You could go with any of those, and there are an infinite number of crises of masculinity, and I think that's my frustration. And I think a lot of it stems from the first time I confronted a lot of these trends were in, Malcolm Gladwell type essays, which I read a lot of until I started to hate them all, and it was all like, yes, this is true, or the opposite is true, or neither is true, and I don't know what to make of any of that. So like, are we watching the Northman? It's called. That's the one where beautiful blonde people murder other people, right? Yeah. So are we watching that because we are so seeped in a world of toxic masculinity? With Trump on one side and I don't know who the example is in the left, but I'm sure there is one on the other. Or is it that we're so in need, we're so hungry for masculinity because we don't have examples of like you can
With
do it.
Trump on one side and the same guy on the other. Right. Probably
Right,
Bernie
exactly.
Sanders is like the
Right. I mean, oh, that's funny. You think of him as a masculine trope, Bernie Sanders.
I think he sometimes gets grief for being like a
Oh, like
like a
Bernie Bros. Like
Bernie
he's
Bros,
focusing on
right? And
right.
being a presumptuous complaining man.
Totally. And there's that concept of like mansplaining, where I don't know
Right.
whether it's more frequent now or whether it has always been for the history of time, and just our talking about it now is indicative of that we've gone
Yeah.
beyond it. But that's I think the best articulation of my skepticism when it comes to trend pieces. That not that trends don't exist, but that they constantly and simultaneously exist, and trying to define one's terms narrowly enough to make a compelling new case is immensely difficult.
That seems totally reasonable and astute and correct, and yet I had a very scientific experience giving
You know,
my
when you add the word "very" to scientific,
or
it makes
experience.
it really makes it really scientific.
Yeah.
This is the
I have a
it wasn't
scientific
just
anecdote for you.
exactly.
So for Easter, I got my children presents, which is Easter is now like a miniature Christmas. It's terrible. It's ridiculous. But
Awful.
do you do Easter too?
Yeah, my wife's mother is a huge Easter lady,
Okay.
and my
Yeah,
idiot
yeah.
kids still believe in the Easter Bunny, which is, I mean, Owen is going to be 9 in July, and he questions the shit out of everything. Like you can't get through a meal without him saying
Right. Why
like
should
is
I
that
trust your
fork
authority?
with metal or plated silver, and is it valuable, and could I sell it, and if I can sell it, why don't we sell it? You know, or like is when you have twins, does that mean you have to have sex twice? And if you have sex only
That's a smart
once, and
question.
they're no, it's great. And it's like, but if you like, how long does sex take? And is 10 minutes? Is that boring? Do you get bored during sex? And it's like, well, if you don't, why not? Because it feels good. But like things that feel good still get boring, right? So like everything he questions. With the Easter Bunny, he's like, oh, I guess the Easter Bunny knew I was having a sleepover this weekend because he came the next day. Like I don't, I get it's a willful suspension of disbelief, but I don't. And once in a while, he'll be like, does the Easter Bunny know about daylight savings? Or like, does the Tooth Fairy, how many kids does each Tooth Fairy go to?
Yeah. Tooth Fairy's real flimsy. That one's hard.
Oh, it's the worst. It's the worst. And I, with Santa, I mean, because I mean, Jews don't do this shit. Like that's I don't. But with Santa and the Easter Bunny, I'm just like I don't have that kind of connect. Like ask mom about the technicalities of how that works.
Yeah.
But yeah, Easter is worse than Christmas because Easter, all the presents are chocolate and sugar, and it just makes the kids into overstimulated lunatics, and the rest of the day is terrible. And there's nothing there other than like a meal that they don't really want to eat. Like I don't like there's
Because they're full of chocolate.
because they're full of chocolate, and they don't like want to eat the rabbit prepared by my mother-in-law makes bunny.
Wait, she does rabbit? She serves rabbit on Easter?
Yeah.
That seems like a funny choice.
Yeah. Cool, right? And they don't, is that the same bunny? Is that no? It's a totally different species.
He's like Jesus, like he's or the phoenix, like he gets sacrificed.
He is the body, right? Exactly. He takes the sacrifice. My kids still believe in the Easter Bunny. Do you celebrate Easter? It's just like Christmas. Carry on.
Yeah. My daughter will, in a very bored voice, tell you that it is the celebration of the goddess Yostra. Because I'm sick of.
God, I love how we're all abusing our kids
in
different ways.
Yeah. Oh, and the worst is because my 4-year-old is so bad and so like oppositional. She asked to see a picture of the Easter Bunny, and Joanna has tried to turn the Easter Bunny into give it like a Santa logic, but it's really becoming more like Krampus until she was like, show me a picture of this Easter Bunny. And we showed her a picture of the bunny man from Donnie Darko.
Just the big face.
So like horrifying. So she's terrified of the Easter Bunny now. And anytime she's being bad, Joanna's like, oh, did I hear a thump on the porch? And she'll shoot up the stairs in terror. So that works pretty well for us. But
murder goblin happens to give you candy once a year for Jesus's
unless it eats you.
Yeah.
But I didn't want to give them candy, so I got them dumb toys and things. And I went to the toy store and got these stupid little mystery prize toys from Playmobil.
Okay.
And I realized when I got them that it was they were little figures, like a little person. And there's like somewhat half were pink and half were blue. And my little daughter is very into pink princess stuff. My older daughter is very against pink and princess stuff and doesn't like it at all right now, which just makes sense. So I got the little one a pink one and the older one a blue one. Because like girls can have boy toys, of course, blah, blah, blah. So then they opened them on Easter morning, and my little pink princess daughter opened a beautiful angel in golden armor with a giant spear and huge white wings, right? And my older daughter opened her blue boy packet, and it was a guy with a mustache and a bandana handing out coupons.
What are you talking about? What does it have to do with Easter? How do you even know there were coupons?
But it's like,
they were so small.
They were little plastic chits that said coupon on them.
No.
And they were in a bag. He had a satchel, and they were in a satchel.
What
and he had a shirt.
For?
He was wearing shorts, cut off shorts, and a shirt that said party. It said party on his shirt.
What are you talking about?
So I was like, this is like the feminine and the masculine identity of our time. And it was like Ethan's right. Everything's like
warrior queen.
Like we need to go see the Northman right now.
Yeah. I mean, whatever the company that sold you those eggs thinks about like the ideal man versus the ideal woman, I think maybe will drive more people to see the Northman.
They were all right. All the trend pieces were right.
I believe 30% of that story that you just told. Coupons.
It says, it truly does say coupon. I couldn't believe it. And Josie like tried. Ellie was like, "I got an angel," and Josie's like, "He hands out coupons." And we couldn't believe the smile.
So she's like, "Daddy, what does this say?" Your 4-year-old cannot read the word coupon.
No, my 8-year-old.
The older, right? Oh, I see.
One.
Oh,
yeah.
okay.
So like maybe the little one would have been excited to get the coupon. I was expecting the 8-year-old to like cruelly trick the little one, like pull Esau and what's his name, Jacob.
Jacob. Yeah, there are all sorts of vicious
cruel
trades
tricks.
going on in where our rule in our house is that if there's a trade made, the 6-year-old is always able to trade back forever.
Yeah,
and the 8-year-old is never allowed to trade back. But Dad, we made this trade 6 months ago. Sorry, you know the rules. Whenever Sam wants to trade back, he's allowed to. But Sam ate half of his. Doesn't matter. You knew when making this deal that was part of the. Okay, here's Sam.
That's Solomonic.
That really teaches you to trade with your brother.
Right? Yeah. No, it's like neither a borrower nor a lender be. That's good.
Exactly.
So on a scale of constantly enraged by to barely tolerant of. What did you think of these two things I made you read?
So they're both about bats.
They are both about bats.
I think they both. I think they both have some wonderful parts. I'm very curious.
That's the face you give your children when they show you a shitty drawing they made.
Right. It has some wonderful parts. Yeah. Like the sun is the yellow ball. No, I think they're both really smart. Is that a good start?
Yeah, I think that's probably right. Yeah,
I think they're both really smart.
They're both ridiculous.
I haven't read anything like the philosophy one since I was an undergrad, or maybe teaching some high school or undergrads, and I've never read anything like the children's story.
Yeah,
but I have some theories on why that is, and I'd like to
on why you've never read other things like them, because
why nothing else exists like that.
Right, it's not a successful. There's two unsuccessful subgenres of writing.
I think that's right. I admit the first 5 to 10 pages of the "What It Is Like to Be a Bat" by Thomas Nagel made me upset with you for asking me to read it. But then there were some parts of it that got me thinking that I think are elegantly phrased ideas that you and I have touched on in the past, just drowning in a sea of undefinable terms. And I don't understand why, but we can discuss that or not if you want. And I thought The Bat Poet by Randall Jarrell was a total delight that exists for no reason.
Right. It's like a story that's only for an adult imagining a child reading it.
Right.
I don't think any child at any age would be interested in it.
Well, no human being at any age would be interested in reading it.
Well, I think like an adult writer imagining a child reading it I think like it's that like that like sub bracketed
Right.
mind
Like
is the
if
mind
you
that's
have never met a child but
right. Yeah.
want to write a children's story,
Yes.
then this is a very long version of that.
Yeah.
there
Yeah.
are there are some like really astute observations, some laugh
Yeah.
out loud moments. Like it's charming. It just is for no one. There is no one who would enjoy reading this.
No. Yeah.
Um,
No.
but let's start with wherever you want to start, because now I'm revved up.
All
Now
right. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm looking to go.
So, like a while ago, we were talking about dogs, and we each posited a theory of doghood, and yours was that dogs totally don't give a shit about humans, and they like they have a, what was it, like a totally alien experience, or they just like any emotion that we perceive in them as a projection or something like this.
Right. It's that people discuss how much they love their dogs and how much their dogs love them back.
Yeah.
When in fact, if given a brief moment where they're not either physically tied down or held indoors, dogs will run away forever and never come back. Where I think that humans who love dogs sincerely love dogs, and I don't question that
Yeah.
love,
Yeah. Yeah.
but thinking that the attitude the dog has for the human is in the same realm as what the human has for the dog is, in my experience, obviously false and probably impossible.
Yes. So, and then my glib response was dogs are existentialists. We kidnap them, castrate them, imprison them, enslave them.
Enslave them.
And
Yeah,
then,
you went deep into the dogs as slaves metaphor.
Yeah, yeah. Jack
Which I
London
agree
has
with.
similar language where he talks about the dog thinks the human is a god, but like an evil god, and that's why, like, yeah, they have some, like, I do, like I said, like I do think dogs have emotions, but like they're sort of offset by the brutality of the world in their mind. And my dad, who complains about every episode, and his response to every episode is Brian was right and you're wrong. He said, I think
Mr.
you're both
Smith.
he said, I think you're both kind of wrong, but Brian's less wrong.
I thought you were going to reverse it, at least on this one. Even on this one, he thinks
Even
we're
on
both
this one,
wrong.
yeah.
But,
He said you're both wrong, but Brian's less wrong. He said, I don't think so I should say he has a dog that he loves. He's super affectionate with, and he and his wife like pamper and baby this dog. It's a standard golden doodle. It's enormous and very sweet and very well trained. And
which, to be clear, I have no aesthetic, moral, or emotional problem with. I think if people love their dogs, that's spectacular.
Yeah, no, they're wonderful, and they're like totally the reason why we got our dog, who's much less well trained. He said basically, like, I don't think dogs have memories. He said, like, I think dogs have like longings and associations, but I don't think they.
And
have,
what's
like,
the difference in that case between an association and a memory?
Narrative, I think, mostly. We think of like Pavlov, like the bell rings and your mouth waters. I think like
But
what
with
came
the
to mind
dogs.
for me was like there's a difference between like if I smell popcorn and I like remember a time I went to the Plaza Theater in Atlanta with my girlfriend and blah blah blah, like that's a narrative memory. Whereas if I like walk outside a bar and I like long for a cigarette, that's not a memory. That's like a compulsion. That's like a strong feeling I have that's sort of below the level of memory. And basically his claim was like dogs have those, but they don't really. So like the world, and because they have, their sense of smell is super developed, the world is like a map of very strong sensory associations, and they have kind of like primal longings that churn through them, including like a longing for a pack, a longing for mating, a longing, whatever, to eat, but they don't have a narrative.
And that fits well with our understanding of instinct. Like when we talk about animal instinct, we would say we experience hunger and lust and fatigue and anger or violence or frustration, whichever one you want to call that, in the way that animals do in the moment.
Yeah.
But we also have a conscious, what you would call narrative, and what Descartes might call the mind soul, that animals don't have, right? That fits in with
I think
your dad's
so.
perspective.
Yeah, I think so. And so they have very strong longings and associations in response to humans as well. I mean, including at times when humans are absent, but they don't really have a story about what's happening, or like a persistent, continuous sense of self necessarily.
So that answers my question of my sort of pushback about dogs running away forever, even though they theoretically love you. Your
Right.
dad's response would be is they're not longing for freedom constantly and they take the opportunity to escape. It's just that they see an open door and outside smells like other dogs, so they run away, and then they're driven to the next place and the next place by their instincts or by their urges.
Yeah, and I mean, and very often dogs do come back, but sometimes they get hit by cars. Sometimes they get like another thing draws them away and away and away, and they never make it back. But yeah, so all like whether they stay away forever or do come back, it's a matter of longing and association, not of like a sense of like this is my home and these are my people. So that was his claim. So that was what then made me think about this article that I read in college and just had a vague memory of being kind of weird and interesting. So this is Thomas Nagel in 1974 wrote this piece, "What is it like to be a bat?" He published it in the Philosophical Review, and it was prompted by what in philosophy is called the hard problem, which is one of those obnoxious philosophy terms for something very specific that they assume everybody already knows. The hard problem is understanding why we have or how we have an experience in the first person, like how the mechanics of our biology give rise to this thing we call qualia or experience or first person or perspective or a self or a soul. And he is responding to a bunch of philosophers who had said, hey, it's all basically just mechanical. There is no like problem solved. No, it's not hard at all. Don't worry about it, man. And his response is like, well, any account of consciousness that doesn't involve that doesn't like take into account the actual first person experience is clearly like incomplete. And then
it even takes him a beat to get there. So
it takes him a while to get there.
I think that the clearest context he offers is without consciousness, the mind-body problem would be much less interesting. Meaning, if you didn't have consciousness, there'd be no reason to separate the mind from the body and see how they interact.
Yeah.
But with consciousness, he writes, it seems hopeless.
Yes. And then he makes an argument that I think my experience of philosophy is like I've always had a kind of a sweet tooth for it. And as I've gotten older, I've continued to be interested in it and read it from time to time. But I think when I was younger, I thought of it as a serious means to pursuing truth. And I think as I've gotten older, I find it's more and more just like an occasion for interesting ways of talking and thinking and like devices and tropes and conceptions that are like valuable in themselves, but that don't really get us any closer to some core reality.
It feels more like a game to you and less like some teleological journey.
Yeah, I think so. And again, like a game of like my favorite materials, which is like words and ideas. So
right.
So and that's sort of what that was my vague memory of this paper. And then I went back and I find it to be, you're right, it is weird.
And it's immensely influential, by the way.
It's famous, which is the only reason I would have read it in college, because it was a famous article. Yeah.
Right. I mean, it has in many ways defined the hard problem since it's been written, and many, many other philosophers return to it to either poke holes in it or to agree with it, especially as we enter this world that I know a little bit about, which is trying to bridge that gap between neurological biology and psychology. I don't think it was written with that in mind necessarily entirely, but the where does synapse firing stop and consciousness begins, or if one stops and the other begins at all, is a question that obsesses philosophers, psychologists, and neurologists in a way that I still think we're very, very, very far from answering. But this is one of the, legs on a stool that's propping up that debate still.
So the reason it's what is it like to be a bat specifically, he says, is basically like he went as far down the great chain of being as he could without going to the level which he defines as like the level of like a wasp, which is the one where like people start to be skeptical that the wasp has an experience in any meaningful way. Whereas like a bat is about the lowest you can go, where people still think like, yeah, there's something going on. Like the bat has some experience. And in addition to that, unlike say a mouse, He says, even without the benefit of philosophical reflection, anyone who has spent some time in an enclosed space with an excited bat knows what it is to encounter a fundamentally alien form of life. They just have a super different experience than whatever their experience is. It must be super, super different than ours.
And that's some of his best writing. When he's describing
when he's describing being a bat.
It's exactly. Yeah, it's wonderful.
Yeah. He says their brains are designed to correlate the outgoing impulses with the subsequent echoes. He's talking about the high-frequency shrieks, the echolocation, and the information thus acquired enables bats to make precise discriminations of distance, size, shape, motion, and texture comparable to those we make by vision. But bat sonar, though clearly a form of perception, is not similar in its operation to any sense that we possess, and there is no reason to suppose that it is subjectively like anything we can experience or imagine. I think that argument ends up being a little bit shakier on both sides than he gives it credit for. Sorry,
totally agree, because like he talks about blind people a little bit later on, and I'm pretty sure blind people do that. Like I think part of the tapping is an echoing of the sound they're making, whether it's subconscious or conscious. I don't know. Like I think that humans are capable of approaching this type of experience, and I think
smell
that
also works in a way that's not totally different than that. My favorite moment in the essay, just because it is mostly because of the independent clause of it, because it's such a funny logical maneuver. He says, "It will not help to try to imagine that one has webbing on one's arms, which enables one to fly around at dusk and dawn, catching insects in one's mouth, that one has very poor vision and perceives the surrounding world by a system of reflected high-frequency sound signals, and that one spends the day hanging upside down by one's feet in an attic."
It's that last line. It's so when you know it's a joke, right? Because he makes it an attic. Like it's specific. Without the specifics of it being an attic, it could be serious, but he's sort of fucking with you with the attic.
Yeah.
It's the next line that I think is the thesis of the piece, insofar as it has one. Insofar as I can imagine this, which is not very far, what you just read, it tells me only what it would like for me to behave as a bat behaves. But that's not the question. I want to know what it is for a bat to be a bat.
Yeah.
And that is talking about a fundamental impossibility of empathy, if I'm reading it correctly.
Yeah, well, and it depends on how you define empathy, because I don't know that he's even getting to emotion at this point, but
and that's part of my issue with this piece a little bit. Like, I don't understand what his point is if it's not leading towards empathy, and I'm not sure if it is leading towards empathy. But just to circle back to finish the approach, do you think he agrees or disagrees with your dad, or you or me? Like, do you think Nagel would just throw up his hands and say, like, yes, you are right, the goal should be to imagine such things, but it is very hard to imagine them? Or does this paper weigh in on one of these perspectives?
If anything, I think he seems to err on the side that it probably the experiences of other creatures are very alien to our own. It's like that seems to probably he would. My guess is if he had to choose, he would side with my dad. But he goes on and says he says, I can't remember where it is exactly, but he says basically he says this is not a matter of just the privacy of a personal experience. He says, what I'm not saying is that you can't imagine what it's like to be another person. You can imagine what it's like to be another person. This is where the argument seems weakest to me, because he's so precise in his articulation of the privacy of experience that then to say oh, but it had to be a bat, it couldn't be another person, feels like, well, that's just kind of what makes the title of the essay interesting. He makes sort of both opposing arguments in a way. He almost convinces me both that no one can imagine what it's like to be anyone else or anything else, but also boy, our imaginations do some pretty interesting work imagining what it's like to be a bat or to be another person or to be this or that.
And maybe because I'm me and far more interested in people than I am in animals, I kept on waiting for that final move to occur, where I kept on waiting for him to apply the lesson of bats to the lesson of whether it's possible to empathize or get inside the mind or perspective of a fellow human being. And he seems to hedge there, unless I'm mistaken. He seems to end the essay before it gets there. He writes in the draft, in terms of the pagination we have at page 444 at the bottom, Certainly, it appears unlikely that we will get closer to the real nature of human experience by leaving behind the particularity of our human point of view and striving for a description in terms of accessible to beings that could not imagine what it is like to be us. If the subjective character of experience is fully comprehensible only from one point of view, then any shift to greater objectivity, that is, less attachment to a specific point of view, does not take us nearer to the real nature of the phenomenon. It takes us farther away from it. That's really confusing. Yeah. What that means, I believe, is that our instinct is to, if we want to know truth, is to have a more view from the top, to get us out of the subjective and into a sort of scientific perspective. But his point is that if you really want to know the nature of human beings or a human being, you want to be as close to that human being as possible. You want to be as much in the mind of that human being as possible. And that to me is a really complicated and wonderful point. And I think it's what we've stumbled on a couple times when I have accidentally previously, but now I'm purposefully arguing on behalf of fiction over nonfiction, where I think that the subjectivity of fiction is really its value, and that trying to talk about trend pieces, as we were earlier, what people tend to do, or what human beings are like, or what it appears that he's doing, or what he told me he's doing, although those might be factual in some way and real or true in our mind, they are far less interesting to me because they are farther from the human condition, or what is actually compelling or unique or exciting about human brains and human experience, in a way granting ourselves the power to invent. You lose all the real stuff, the objectivity, the reality, the fact, but at least you get to that exciting humanity.
Yeah. I mean, and that's why I think maybe the strongest claim that the article makes is really that the title, "What is it like to be a bat?" is the right kind of question to ask. Whereas asking what is the nature of consciousness is a doomed question, because science is objective, and what you're asking is, what is subjectivity? And objectivity can never answer that. But what you can answer is well, what about this particular thing or person, and whether you can get closer or farther from that. I mean, again, from a writerly perspective, I'd love to dive into a bat's mind, or I'd love to dive into the mind of this person or that person. That's the whole game. But that is the question to ask, and so it's not a question that can be answered scientifically. I was reminded of Caitlin Greenidge has I think a very smart but sort of necessarily abbreviated article in the New York Times from a few years ago called "Who Gets to Write What?" The basic argument of that article, she's talking about people writing novels in which she's sort of responding to the Lionel Shriver sombrero rant, but she's talking about people writing novels and in which the characters have radically different experiences from their own, and her final conclusion when it came to her own novel was the only way to credibly write another person, whatever that person's experience, is to try to locate yourself in that person's perspective and write, basically decide to love this person and look out at the world as that person for a little bit.
And I agree with that. Yeah. Franzen hides behind the word love also, and uses it when talking about cultural appropriation. That his mind, the question that often comes up in these conversations about cultural appropriation or human appropriation, whatever you want to call it, is that why is it okay that I write women characters but not Black people characters? Right, yeah. And there is no answer to that question, which is why I write both, and I've been criticized for writing both.
Or but old people, or
right, exactly. Or any other experience. I think the easiest way to think about it is race versus gender. But yes, absolutely, old people, or people who have fought in wars, or people who are bankers, or anything at all. And Jonathan Franzen, when asked that question, almost always responds in terms of love, where he says well, I have loved women and in a variety of ways, in a variety of ages, variety of times, and therefore I feel comfortable writing from their perspective. Whereas I have not loved enough African Americans to write from their perspective. I don't really understand why loving someone would give one the right to write
Yeah,
WRITE from their perspective, but
sure.
it's that, but it is a good answer if you don't give it too much thought. I also feel that
That was the
the
same interview, I think, where he said, "I thought about adopting an Iraqi child because then I would love it and I would understand the perspective," which was
he
like
said,
gave him a lot
yeah,
of grief. But like, I think he's a little bit of an innocent.
he
And he just sort of
says it a lot.
tells you
Yeah,
his thoughts as they,
yes, I totally agree. And as you know, I'm a fan of his work in
yeah, oh,
spite
me
of
too, me too. Yeah,
his assholeness at times, assholishness. But from what you said about the Times article, I absolutely agree that the best writing I do about people who aren't me are thinking through the context or the conflict or the world in which a character different from me is in, and imbuing that character with honest psychology, which I guess is just a version of saying what I would do at that point. And that I think the what is it like to be a bat comes into mind because the implication from the article is that that's a mistake, that putting a version of you inside an old person or a black person or a gay person or a child or a woman or really anybody other than you is the beginning of an error, that you're not going to be able to empathize to any compelling degree. And to that, my response would be like, okay, but novels need multiple characters, and even if you're writing in the first
yeah,
person, like trying to write what other people would say and do is better for the book. But I do think it's a reasonable question. Also, Nagel, I think, raises an issue that has been making me crazy, but I haven't really found the words to describe it since high school, when science begins to be taught through analogy, which I am deeply frustrated by and always have been. You know, you hear about enzymes for the first time in ninth grade bio, and you hear about how like it's like a lock and key, and a key enters the lock, and if it fits the lock, then you know the enzyme goes with the receptor and therefore
right.
can continue the process. But like that doesn't explain how enzymes work at all. That's just
Yeah,
an analogy that lets you know how locks and keys work, and enzymes are other things. And if you want to imagine it like that, like I guess it can be helpful, but it also can be wrong. So when Nagel writes, but philosophers share the general human weakness for explanations of what is incomprehensible in terms suited for what is familiar and well understood, though entirely different. That is a spectacular sentence, and I wish
oh
I had
yeah,
had that sentence at my disposal for the last few decades, because that to me does a great job in one sentence articulating a frustration that I've had but not been able to say for years.
yeah. That's no. I mean, my. I don't think I ever got the lock and key, but then again, science was my weakest subject area. The version of that I remember liking a fair amount was really the version we inherited from the quantum physicist, which is like in chemistry, you get the picture of the Bohr model of the atom, which is like a little, it's like a it's like a Copernican solar system. So it's like they're all perfect circles. But like what you're taught is like, this is not what an atom looks like, but it's kind of
Right.
like what an atom's like. And then you get like all these other, it's like the elephant. Then you're like, it's like, it would be like if you did the story of the blind man and the elephant, but you said like, an elephant is a hard column. An elephant
Exactly.
is a big
Exactly.
tail. An elephant is a rope. And you just sort of like, it's all these things, but it's none of these things. And they're all sort of true. And so I actually kind of like, you get the two slit experiment where you're like, both things happen and neither makes sense. Deal with it. So I kind of love that, but I think you're right. Just the facile, straight ahead. This is what that is like the kind of the conventional analogy form of instruction in science seems totally counterproductive.
And we see it all the time in ways that matter in contemporary medicine. I know
Mm-hmm.
most about the brain when it comes to this, but we have it in cancer as well. But in the brain, we're always seeing how like, well, we know these foods are, affect the brain because the brain lights up when you see them, or
Right.
like,
Yeah.
and it's
Yeah.
like, what does that mean?
Yeah.
Like if you put lights on somebody's brain and then you
Yeah.
do stuff, like the lights will turn on, but that's not actually helpful in terms of understanding what the neuroscience is and what might lead to migrainous vertigo or
Right.
anything along those lines. It's a way that people who aren't able to explain the system, but they're really talking about an entirely different system. And I think that works in terms of bats and humans, that what you're doing when you're saying what are bats like? Well, they like eating, so they're hungry and they fly around eating moths, and then they can't see, but like they tap on stuff, and it's sort of like hearing and sort of like feeling, sort of like seeing. At a certain point, Nagel is saying like, what are we doing here? Like, that's not what a bat is like. That's just what you would be like in a wingsuit. And I think that
Right.
that's a funny sort of perceptive way to think about animals and other people and whatever else you want to apply it to.
Yeah, and but I think like at least the way I perhaps tendentiously choose to read him is to say like, yes, you by inserting your own little Brian mind into an imagined bat body, you're never going to find out what it's like to be a bat, but better to put on a wingsuit and try to imagine than to break out a microscope and assume that you're going to get an answer. Like
I agree with you, but does Nagel agree with you?
Well, no, I think
I'm
like,
not
this
sure
is,
he
this
does.
Is, I think he is in a way, like he's a good enough writer that he ends up complicating. Basically, he seems to want to just refute reductionism in the mind-body problem, but he ends up being a good enough writer and good enough at imagining what it's like to be a bat that he ends up like both making it harder for us to believe that we can imagine other people and making it easier for us to believe we can imagine bats. And just to like the moral seems to be like, if you want to understand consciousness, keep imagining first person points of view in different ways, and you'll never get, like, it's an asymptote, it's a Zeno's paradox, you're never going to get there, but that's the right way to do it. Though, yeah, I don't know that he ends with, he has two other little things that I did want to at least touch on, because he ends with an interesting, I think, impossible challenge, which is another version of the what is it like. He says basically, like, if you really wanted to like find a way to solve this problem scientifically, he said one might try, for example, to develop concepts that could be used to explain to a person blind from birth what it was like to see. When I was a little boy, my mom had this book that probably was very well intentioned, and all I really remember was the title and the concept. But the title was Hailstones and Halibut Bones, and the concept of the book was that it was a series of descriptions meant to convey to blind people what colors were like. And I remember just thinking, like, that seems crazy. Like, that's like, if you read these descriptions, like, and you can see, then you'll say like, those are white, like those are red. But like, that seems like a bizarre way to try to like convey to a blind person. So like, he brings up this sort of interesting question about like, well, what would, if you were to try to come up with a vocabulary for that, what would it be? Because I don't think it's hailstones and halibut bones, but
the only example he gives is one that he immediately dismisses, which is red is like the sound of a trumpet.
Yeah, was that same like dumb poetic way to do it,
right?
Which seems, which I again like there is such a big tradition of synesthesia in poetry, and in fact, like Cameron is like really big on synesthesia, but it just I find I just don't have any access to it, so it never makes any sense to me.
But I don't know enough about it. But is it consistent from person to person? Totally
inconsistent.
Right.
Sometimes there are kind of interesting overlaps, but basically it's totally individual.
Right. I was going to say Rorschach test, but that implies it suggests something deeper. I always thought it was arbitrary.
I think it's arbitrary. There may be, my guess is, as with like some words seem to have a certain mimetic quality. Like my guess is in some cases because there's some agreement people have sometimes had about like what color associates to whatever thing. But I think it's basically arbitrary with maybe a few little ripples of like causal relationship.
Because my instinct would be to go in the opposite direction, where instead of trying to explain to somebody blind from birth what it's like to see color, I would almost redefine what it means to be blind from birth as meaning you don't have access to understanding color. Like it seems like that goal is problematic.
Yeah, I mean, I think I kind of wonder about this. Like, one way to think about it would be like, if you look at the wall and the wall is painted orange, what that means is that every place on the wall, insofar as the wall is painted orange, like every place on the wall is in some sense the same. And like
reflects and accepts light in the same way.
Right. No, I mean, but I'm even just like starting phenomenologically, like starting from the experience of it rather than starting from some scientific description or starting from like an analogical symbolic description.
Okay.
Like the whole wall surface has a sameness from top to bottom, so that like the orange at the top is the orange at the like insofar as it's painted orange. And if it's not the same, that's either because it's the texture, like some other factor has changed, or because it's a different orange. And like that's like saying almost nothing, but I feel like it's saying the bare beginning of something about color. And like I kind of am interested in trying to pursue I mean, like that's a philosophical word game that interests me, but I don't think I don't think I'm smart enough to solve it. The other moment that I find like fascinating and chilling in this article, which is like so many philosophical articles I read, like my favorite part will be a footnote.
Right.
And in this one, he says, we may call this the subjective character of experience. It is not captured by any of the familiar, recently devised reductive analyses of the mental, for all of them are logically compatible with its absence. It is not analyzable in terms of any explanatory system of functional states or intentional states, since these could be ascribed to robots or automata that behaved like people, though they experienced nothing. And he footnotes that, and the footnote reads, perhaps there could not actually be such robots. Perhaps anything complex enough to behave like a person would have experiences, but that, if true, is a fact which cannot be discovered merely by analyzing the concept of experience. That's just such a weird, offhand, little creepy thought that, like, once you have sufficiently, I mean, basically, it's like it's sort of reverse engineering the Turing test. Like, once you have convincingly contrived an automaton that responds like a human, you have to treat it as if it is a human, or it has an internal experience comparable.
And that's what Ishiguro's Clara and the Sun is about. It's about
okay.
it's about
this
creating
is his newest novel.
Yeah, it's about creating a robot that is able to act as the companion of children, and then in creating that robot, the robot necessarily has what develops into a type of consciousness.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And I think about like those weird little like seal robots that are used in Japan to comfort and be companions for people in nursing homes. And they're part of what I imagine with that is like anybody you know well enough, you construct a little working simulation of them in your mind, and you can kind of run that simulation and like rewatch a movie imagining that person watching it, and there is like a flicker of internal experience that presumably like has some relationship to that person's actual internal experience. And like even if the robot only had these sort of outward like sounds that it made and motions that it made, there's something that, you know, I hesitate with like using a word like sacred outside of, you know, an actual religious context, but like there's something not to be quickly dismissed about the simulation that would provoke in the minds of anyone who interacted with it.
This is Alice's favorite way that we talk, which is when we start professing love for our wives. But I think that there's some aspect of this in terms of the love I have for my wife.
Yeah.
Where like my day matters more to me because I know that there is somebody else who is sort of invested in it, whom I can tell the bullshit and ephemera, you know, that really doesn't matter to anyone. So in the reality is probably closer to like, okay, there's a time, many days where Brian will tell me things that I don't really care about, and I will act interested because I love him and that's what he likes. In my mind, it's like, wait, let me catch Alex up on the, you know, with the latest of what the teacher and the other teacher told each other, because I told her that the student before wasn't right, and she's gonna, and it makes that matter more in my life because there's a recipient of the narrative. I don't know whether it actually matters that the recipient is a full human being, you know, or if it's just a listening device. But I could see, even if a robot isn't conscious, I could see a human being's desire to make that robot conscious strong enough to make us, to imbue that robot with a consciousness or something like a consciousness in the role it plays in our lives.
Well, so, and there is a little micro consciousness that robot has in the mind of somebody who spends all day with it, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that's something one of the reasons why little kids like stuffed animals is because like they suck on stuffed animals and they like the smell of their own saliva. But I
Oh,
think another aspect of
it's
it
horrible.
is that uh, they create a world where that stuffed animal is there for them and steady
Yeah.
and cares for them and is cared for, and there's a reciprocity that's either implied or invented with children. I could see as an adult, I think people do that with spouses who have neurological disorders and maybe aren't fully themselves anymore. I think people
Yeah.
certainly do it with animals.
Yeah. Or like
They imbue
infants. Yeah.
into their dogs, right, or infants, and the bridge from that to a robot to a stuffed animal is probably smaller than I had thought of previously.
Yeah. And you are more inclined to feel warmly toward yourself because there is like there's the old like self-help maxim about like don't let someone live rent-free in your head, but like your loved ones do live rent-free in your head, and like if somebody living in your head loves you, then like you're more inclined to feel that. I have almost though, because I think I think there's sort of two things going on when you talk about giving like your wife being a witness to your day. One is like the things you are witness to, your wife then also sort of gets a front row seat to, in the way that like among like most couples I know, with the exception of like discrete time limited surprises, you don't really tell a married person something and expect that person not to tell his spouse. Like you
Absolutely.
mostly say like the confidence is a two body condition.
Right. You almost don't, at least I try never even to ask somebody not to. Like either don't tell the person
Right. Yeah.
or
If you
assume they're
tell
going to
someone, you
go.
have to assume
Right.
he's going to tell his wife.
Right. There's something almost inappropriate of saying, I'm going to tell you this, but don't let Alex know.
Yeah.
Even if it is because a friend of mine doesn't want Alex to think worse of him or her.
Oh, right. Yeah. It's sort of like I'd like to bury something in your yard.
Right.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. But so I think like they're like part of this, like one of the privileges of like a close relationship like that is that you get a front row seat to all the weird shit your spouse has a front row seat to, and like gets to which by the way is one thing that is like super weird about having a psychiatrist as a wife in a small town.
Oh, interesting.
Where like
right.
a lot of people we run into are her patients. I have gleaned, but I can't know. And yeah, so like it's a weird thing.
Right.
There is actually like there's a one way wall, or one way mirror. So
well, good. I mean, her patients.
Yeah. Oh, there's just. I mean, she's like,
that.
totally, probably excessively so. She's super.
That would make me insane if I were you. I would be so
it makes me a
hungry
little insane
for the like you know the answer. Like you just tell me, how do you like? Or why did they treat me like that? You might know. You might know.
Like people will come up and I think like I know I'm not violating confidence because I don't have any confidence, in this situation. But like people will come up to us in public and talk to her, and not only will I not know that person, but she can't introduce me. And so if that person doesn't introduce herself, I just stand next to her while this person will, and then sometimes that person will like say hi to me. Because they know who I am,
right?
And I just have no idea what. Like, and usually I kind of can infer. Like, I guess this is a patient, but it's super weird.
One thing I do though, and I don't know if I've admitted this fully before, but when I tell stories to everyone, but even to Alex, I will exaggerate the story to try to make her feel the intensity that I felt while living through it. Sure. So that's like if I waited online for 10 minutes, I would sometimes I tell the story as 20 just to indicate the severity of the anxiety.
David Mamet calls this the wind chill factor.
Oh, talk to me about that. What?
Oh, he has a great book called 3 Uses of the Knife where he just talks about storytelling and plays specifically. But he says like the wind chill factor is a way that it's the pseudo-objective, subjective shading we put on things to say like,
right.
It was 50 degrees, but it felt like.
Right. But is his lesson there that then in fiction and or reality just exaggerate, like lie, so it does?
Oh, I think he's
feel more intense.
Partly he's like taking the principles of storytelling and like demonstrating how we have some access to them already. He was basically saying like, here's why this feels satisfying, or like, here's why we respond this way and why we tell. He's like, oh no, he's like everybody uses the wind chill factor, but like, if you're going to be a storyteller, you should like know that is a thing
consciously.
Yeah.
Right.
But sorry, you were saying you exaggerate stories for your wife and other people.
Oh, and I'm trying to figure out what that, if the purpose, because I think the facts are less important than the emotions or my reaction. So it's less having a front row seat to the same play that I'm watching as it is somebody else to experience the play that I've seen. Like it's more about like, I was happy in the morning, then I was a little sad in the afternoon, and then I was tired after that. And like, let me explain that to you by showing and not telling. Because what kind of story is that if you're just talking about ways you felt along the day?
Yeah, so I think I do a weirdly different thing. So there was an example of it the other day that like I got super embarrassed because of. So I think I know that like part of what she especially enjoys about having a husband is getting a front row seat to all the weird shit I see. So I know that she will like to hear about something I heard or saw, and so I like will be eager to do a good job relating that to her. But I mostly try to like either bracket or purge my own subjective experience. And like my sense of her, like I'm very aware that she is this mind, like she lives rent free in my head and is this mind that, you know, I think about thinking about her day as well as thinking about me. And I am appalled for her to imagine my internal experience. And so I try to
because you're ashamed at how petty and small you are.
I guess I think I just like I don't like I mostly try to wall that off and like give her full access to like my box seats, but like conceal the internal royal of like my emotions and my subjectivity.
So everything is an anecdote as opposed to a novel?
Yeah, mostly. I mean, or I'll talk to her about ideas and she'll like, we don't do that much. She would tolerate that when we like used to go on long walks together.
I was going to say, Alex and I don't talk about ideas. She would have no patience for me.
She hates it mostly, but she'll tell me like I am her ASMR, where she's like, I don't really follow
the sound
like
coming from your face.
She's like, I like your voice. I like the drone of your voice as you kind of ramble on about some boring thing. So she'll tell me that, and then a lot of what we talk about is like the structure of her stories, her short stories that she's working on. So we do a lot of that. But
wait a minute, the specifically the structure. What percentage of what percentage of your conversational time is spent discussing the structure of your wife's short stories?
Of time that she and I have, that's actually a sustained conversation, which as you know, is quite limited.
Of course.
A large percentage.
Because I acted more surprised than I guess I should be, because a large percentage of the time I spend with my wife is talking about the inner workings of where she works and her sort of professional characters and
she can tell me almost none of that in her case.
Right. And this is something professional that she does. But so has the act of editing and working with her in that way become, I try not to cringe when I say this, but like an act of love? Like, is it a way that, is it the space within your marriage where you can, I mean, there are other spaces also, but has that, as opposed to, because like I edit Alex's like speeches, but that is a frustrating, awful experience for us both. Like, she asked me to do it because the speeches are better at the end, but there's a lot of, no, you don't get what I'm trying to say, and no, that doesn't work, and what do you mean? And I'm tense and she's tense. She's like, maybe I should just do it myself. And I said, no, that's what you say at this, like, let's figure this out. And at the end of it, the speech is slightly better.
Right.
That doesn't sound like what you're experiencing, because that's an act of like familial duty on my end. Whereas what you seem to be talking about is an act of like an act of like lovely teamwork or something. I don't know if I have.
We've gotten a lot of that. Like what you described with Alex's speeches has been a lot of it. I think she has gotten better at responding to feedback, and I've gotten better at giving feedback in a way that doesn't make us yell. Like previously her comparison was like, when I help her with a story, her experience is like when her dad taught her to drive, where she just like hates me, the whole time. And then at the end, she's like, well, I guess it's good that this happened, but fuck you anyway, you know? So I think that has been a lot of it. I think we've both gotten better at it. And so it's more harmonious now. But I think like my experience when it comes to like helping her with stories is like, I'll just like preface this by saying like, in any like a world in which I ever were to talk about my sex life with Joanna would have to exist in like a second secret podcast that only I could ever listen to.
I was going to say, no matter how much people are willing to pay, I don't
never.
Think that's
so like
that
would be that. So I'm setting that aside. But that said, I think the way I think about my helping her with stories is the way like cartoonish, crude, confident men in movies talk about their ability to have sex. They're like
I really open her up.
I lay that plot so good, right? Like it's something I know I'm very good at that I don't, that like, I feel it's one of the few places where I'm like that guy, that lawyer down the street pulling in $600,000 a year, he couldn't do this, could he? Like, that's like one of the few places where I feel like a swagger about my ability to do something for my wife. So that's that's part of what it is for us as well. And part of why I enjoy it. But,
it's a service. It's a service.
Yeah, it's a service. No, exactly. Like it's a service, and it's like I am good at that, and like most people are not good at that thing. They're mostly better at lots of other things that I'm terrible at. But like that's one place where like it's like Dirk Diggler. It's like that's my one. You know,
that's your special. That's what you got.
But I do really try to like. I am if anything like I get embarrassed when my own subjectivity emerges into view. And an example of this, like a very dumb example of this, we were watching the insane Bad Vegan show, and like there is this weird.
How far are you in? We're
3 episodes in, so it's totally insane.
The last sort of 20 minutes changes a lot of what came before in a way that I don't fully understand. But yeah, the show is insane for a variety of reasons. All the characters act irrationally throughout,
right?
And there are very low stakes. like you know, it's like what will happen to this vegan restaurant and the wealthy people who have funded it, you know, and then like a comic book villain comes in. Like it's a very strange, it's
super weird. Yeah.
It's genre confused. But anyway, so you were watching that.
So but there's this period of the movie where this character who is like a schlubby, unemployed megalomaniac and like maybe genuinely a little bit insane and like gambling addict and like sort of parasitic, horrible person who like abandoned his wife and her kid. He's like, I mean, he is, you know, I would hesitate to like use words like loser or failure, but like if you were to apply them, one might apply them to this guy. And yet at the same time that you're learning about all of his profound deficiencies, he's also talking about like how he's godlike and he's amazing.
He's a genius and
God,
right.
He's like smarter and stronger and better than everybody at everything.
Yes.
And the little thought that came to mind was I told my wife, I like laughed and said like, oh, I saw this little interview that DJ Khaled did with Larry King. And DJ Khaled does this like all I do is win no matter what. Yeah.
Right.
So I think like I had this slightly inaccurate memory in which he was like in prose verbalizing the lyrics to his song. Where he's like, well, I'd like to win, and then I'd win at this and I win
no
at
matter
that.
What. No matter what happens.
No matter what happens. I'm like, I like to be like a win in my clothing, I win in my ladies, I win with my money, I win. And then Larry King sort of stares at me and he says, how did you gain all the weight? And Joanna cracked up, and then she instantly looked. It's like the thing you fear in class, where like your kid instantly Googles the thing you just said.
Right.
Like she looked it up, and like it's sort of like that. Like that is the question Larry King says, and it is funny. But like the thing that DJ Khaled said before that was like a much less funny approximation of like talking about how he likes to have nice clothes and he likes this and that. And so she was like, oh, I want to find the clip where he says, I want to win, I win and win and win. And I was like,
and you're like,
no,
stop looking.
I remembered a thing like inaccurately because it was like 7 years ago. And my experience with DJ Khaled is like hearing that song and seeing one clip of him. And so like that was my memory. But like it actually genuinely embarrassed me that like there's this moment where like she could see that like I had a clearly objectively inaccurate, personal experience of something that I remembered inaccurately. Like, that was not at all my goal. Ideally, she would have never been aware that I had distorted it in my memory. And that's my, when I go to her, when I think of telling her stories, I always want to purge that subjectivity.
That's interesting. Whereas in my marriage, my wife just assumes that most of what I say is exaggerated or false or misremembered.
So is it when your son comes in, it's like the craziest thing just happened?
Exactly.
Is that how she responds to anything you say?
Yeah. Oh, tell me about it, Brian. Oh, really?
Amazing.
That happened.
Yeah. Wow.
I can't believe it. That's yes, exactly.
Good. So then after I was reminded of this grueling Thomas Nagel essay, which is, how long is, it's a good 16 very dense pages.
I was going to say, feels a lot longer than whatever you're about to say in terms of how long it is.
I then remembered this also overlong piece of prose by Randall Jarrell, the wonderful poet and critic, called The Bat Poet, which is
30 pages, but feels shorter.
Yeah, and it's big. The type is significantly bigger, and the words are shorter. But originally it was a little children's book illustrated by Maurice Sendak.
I know. I was looking for it, and I couldn't find the visuals.
Do you want to summarize what this silly thing I sent you is?
Sure thing. So there's a bat, a bit of a loner, a bit of an eccentric. He is
insomniac.
He initially he is hangs with the other bats on this wire. Is that where, on a wire? Is that where he initially hangs? On a porch. On a porch.
Down from the roof of the porch.
But this bat's not like the other bats. So it doesn't sleep so well during the day. He doesn't want to move to the inside when all the other bats get older and move inside. It's just sort of is a free thinker. Doesn't flutter with the pack.
Mm-hmm.
But then he hears the what kind of bird?
Mockingbird.
The mockingbird. Then he hears the mockingbird. And mockingbird has a beautiful voice. The mockingbird impersonates other animals, but also has a beautiful voice and also drives other animals out of the mockingbird's area.
The mockingbird has bad days, is probably like some days he's a murderous maniac who just attacks everybody.
Is moody. The mockingbird is moody, and the bat, who is a little moody himself, he goes, I don't know, the mockingbird can do it. I want to listen to the mockingbird. Maybe I could do it too. But the bat realizes that the mockingbird can sing with different tones. But when the bat tries, it's all like high-pitched shrieking. So the bat decides, instead of trying to do what the mockingbird does, I'm going to do it my own way, and I'm going to do it with words. So I'm not going to rely on tones because I just do that high pitch squeal. I'm going to do it with words. And in so doing, he becomes a poet, and he goes from animal to animal, looking for an audience for his poems. First, he has a conversation with the mockingbird, who's a bit of a pedant, who discusses the form of his poetry. He then finds an accomplice, an audience in a chipmunk, I believe, who's a big fan. And then he wants to read his final poem. So he writes a poem about the chipmunk. The chipmunk loves it. Then he writes a poem about the mockingbird. The mockingbird is sort of has issues with that poem. And then he finally writes a poem about bats. He goes to his bat buddies, his family, where they've been inside without him all this time. He's about to tell the poem that he wrote about bats to the bats, but instead he falls asleep with them in a big pile of bats' love and solidarity. In
seemingly for winter, it seems to be hibernation.
Oh, he's hibernating. He's hibernating.
They're going to fall asleep and wake up in months. Yeah, that is what happens in this story. There is early on when he's he kind of starts with a little bit of a first person where he's he is the man living in the house and he sees the bat, but he soon shifts his perspective to a very close third of this bat.
Just to give a sense to our listeners, you can really choose from anywhere, but do you mind reading either from the beginning or anywhere else?
Once upon a time there was a bat, a little light brown bat, the color of coffee with cream in it. He looked like a furry mouse with wings. When I'd go in and out of my front door in the daytime, I'd look up over my head and see him hanging upside down from the roof of the porch. He and the others hung there in a bunch, all snuggled together with their wings folded, fast asleep. And he goes on, and then pretty quickly we're following. He says if you pointed a flashlight at them, you'd see them screw up their faces to keep the light out of their eyes. Toward the end of summer, all the bats except a little brown one began sleeping in the barn. he missed them. And from then on, we're in his mind in the third person.
And from that moment in the third person, the writing is funny. Like the
Yeah.
other bats are sort of assholes. We get this line.
Yeah.
He's like trying to get the other bats to come back to where they slept initially because that's where he likes it. And he's like, once you get used to it, you'll like it. The little bat said, once you get used to it, it's wonderful. All right, said the others, we'll try. But they were just being polite. They didn't try.
Yeah.
It's like in this sort of childhood language, this language of children's books. This bat is kind of abused by a lot of the other animals, and that's very charming.
Yeah, though often with like the manners of like rather than just being like shrieked at and attacked by other animals, he's like they'll say like, oh well, go on, we didn't mean to interrupt you. Or like we're sorry about that. Like it feels like like the way human adults are like careless.
And in so doing, he I think is mocking the way people talk to poets, right?
Oh yeah, totally.
It's sort of they're initially there's like, oh, we don't want to hear this, like we no thank you, and then poets insist and they're like, okay, well please go ahead, no we'd love to hear your latest poem. And
yeah,
and it's funny.
It's a funny story in that like Randall Jarrell was about as cruel to poets as anybody could be. Like he once said he accused another poet he said another book of poems, he said it was written on a typewriter by a typewriter.
Didn't he kill himself after a bad review, Randall Jarrell, or am I getting
it wasn't a bad review.
Someone else?
He was institutionalized for a while, and then they let him out with a clean bill of health, and he walked into traffic.
Oh really? Okay.
Yeah. In the like Lowell Berryman crew, he was the rare teetotaler, but apparently he was a huge asshole in person, like always just like really really prickly. But his portrait of being a poet is surprisingly sunny. Like other animals are sort of like bad at responding to the poet, but basically like he like immediately just starts writing like good poems. They're not like, you couldn't put these poems would neither be successful adult poems nor would they be successful children's poems, but like in the story they're good.
I almost wondered whether he wrote the poems and then thought like there's nothing for me to do with these poems, so I'll write a children's story.
Maybe, but they don't even feel like they don't quite they're good. They're like, again, they're in the context of the story, they're exactly right, but they don't really have the character of like his poems that he wrote.
Okay, yeah. I mean, but it's fun. Like the bat got so excited the bat got so excited his fur stood up straight and he felt warm all over. He thought, I'll go to the chipmunk and say, if you'll give me 6 crickets, I'll make a poem about you. Really, I do it for nothing, but they won't respect something if they get it for nothing. I'll say 6 crickets, I'll do your portrait in verse. And then you find out later that the chipmunk has never even heard it, doesn't even know what a cricket is. It's like it's like the whole plan is this cockamamie way to try to get respect from a chipmunk who's never even heard of the currency they're using. Like that is funny in a couple ways. So I see this as genre confused, not only because it's adults wouldn't want to read about a bat and his bat friends, and kids wouldn't want to read about the intricacies of a poet seeking an audience. Right. But it also has a sort of like shouts and murmurs quality to it, you know, like a McSweeney's piece or
the Mockingbirds love to be told that their last song is the best. Yeah.
Right. Where it's like an extended metaphor that leads to absurdity, you know, like the dopey piece I wrote recently was like the humidifier has a bad attitude about like the stress he's under as a humidifier because Wirecutter told him he was the best. And again, like nobody's laughing out loud about that. They're just reading it. And they're going like that's I see what you're doing there. You know,
I think the McSweeney's internet pieces tend to be funnier than Shouts and Murmurs for the most part. Like the Shouts and Murmurs are usually like self-consciously clever. Like it seems like they're both in the same category, but I think on the spectrum, they're
I agree. I mean, I've published them both. I think that the McSweeney's is more willing to go towards the absurdity or the maximalist stuff, which I find funnier than the like wit or the clever
knowingness.
The knowingness, totally. But this has some of that where it's like, oh, that's a witty observation about a poet put inside the perspective of a chipmunk, and like if a chipmunk really were to talk like that, that would be funny, not the kind of joke you would laugh at funny, but like intelligently observed.
Yeah. Oh no, I think that's exactly right. Like part of what's funny about it is that it is as a satire, which it sort of is, and the Mockingbird is clearly like a
fancy
terrifying,
old,
manic depressive old famous poet
yes,
who's both inspirational and like a huge prick.
right.
But like the bat basically like is immediately good at writing poetry, and like the chipmunk is a really lovely, like kind of almost ideal audience that he finds basically right away. And
Forgot about the moment with the cardinal where he promises the cardinal he's going to write a poem, and the cardinal doesn't give a shit. The cardinal doesn't needs to keep on being told what a poem is and doesn't care. But finally, the cardinal's like, "All right, write the poem," and it leads to so much anxiety in the bat. The bat's trying to think of a poem about a cardinal and can't and can't and can't, and finally he just tells the cardinal he can't, and he feels relieved. The line was, "It was wonderful not to have to worry about the cardinal anymore." But I think that sort of the zero stakes anxiety of what a poet or writer of short fiction feels like when there's an arbitrary deadline and then you can just like not worry about it anymore.
Right.
That felt very true to life. And putting it between a cardinal and a bat is fun.
Yeah. No, I think like as a satire, it is funny. It is also though fairly mild. Like it made me I was surprised that the bat was not more miserable or more of a failure given like Jarrell's
sweet.
own it's very sweet.
And the end of it I think has a lot to do with that, where if the bat committed suicide by walking into traffic at the end, I think the whole story would have a very different feeling. But the bat just gets cozy with its loved ones, and that
it is a weird moment because he like forgets his poem and just like succumbs to biology. It's like, I guess I'm going to sleep for 3 months.
Right. And he slowly forgets his poem. It seems like something bad is happening, but it's not. It's sweet.
Not, but it also feels like it's almost like it's the moment where like, and when he wakes up, he was a completely different bat with no memory of anything that came before.
It
he just
sort of speaks to the irrelevance of poetry or something like that.
And it is like the construction throughout is like, I'm going to say him my poem, which always sounds weird, but you're like, well, he's not going to read it because there's no reading and so it does, everything does feel very ephemeral. I was also just sort of like taken by this, so this came out 10 years before Thomas Nagel's article, and in it, like one of the things that does come through is that the three successful poems he does write, which is, or I guess four, he has the one about an owl, one about a chipmunk, one about a mockingbird, and then one about bats. And with the owl one, he says it to the chipmunk who is diurnal and so has never encountered an owl, and the chipmunk shivers and says like, "Oh God, is there something like that?" Because the owl poem, of course, is a horror poem. It's like an Edgar Allan Poe poem because these are bats and chipmunks.
And then we get that wonderful line just about art where it's like, "Why do I like it if it makes me so scared?"
Yeah, I want to hear it again, even though it makes me shiver. Yeah, and then he says the chipmunk poem. The chipmunk says like, "Oh, that's really what it's like to be a chipmunk." And then he even has that line later where he says the bat poem to the chipmunk, and like the chipmunk says, "You bats sleep all day and fly all night and see with your ears and sleep upside down and eat while you're flying and drink while you're flying and turn somersaults in midair with your baby hanging on. And it's really queer." The bat said, "Did you like the poem?" "Oh, of course, except I forgot it was a poem. I just kept thinking how queer it must be to be a bat." It just seemed like I wondered, like, did Thomas Nagel read this to his kid?
No,
like, I don't know.
Especially because
like funny...
that line about hanging upside down in the
like it's both about like how alien the bat's experience is and how you sort of get an insight into it.
It will not help to try to imagine that one has webbing on one's arms, which enables one to fly around at dusk and dawn, catching insects in one mouth, has very poor vision, perceives the surrounding world by a system of reflected high-frequency sound signals, and that one spends the day hanging upside down by one's feet in the attic. That comes from the Nagel, which is almost an academic paraphrase of what you just read from the Jarrell.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and the and part of what makes the little poems charming is that they are written from a bat perspective. So like the sun is described as a million moons. It's and like the shadows are the same as the moonlight. Like the brightest thing in the night is like
the brightest.
So yeah, like this is almost like the children's story equivalent of a thought experiment. Like it's not a real children's story, but like it is imagined to be a children's story. But it is this sort of lovely in a way, like it's a lovely demonstration of the way poetry is a totally unscientific response to the mind-body problem.
Yeah, absolutely.
Poetry and
Right,
literature.
stories. Something else that struck me as I was reading is this was written, I think, in the heyday of like Disney as Disney, like when children's movies were not full of ironic jokes for the parents to laugh at, but were
Yeah.
actually for children.
More earnest. Yeah.
Right. And I think that that's the 40s and 50s. And this was written in what year?
It was published in 64.
Right. So I wonder whether this was a version of what we have now almost exclusively, which we touched on briefly when we discussed Encanto, but which is like a children's entertainment that works on two levels, where I think of Shrek as being the big turning point in that. I could be wrong by a couple of years or a couple movies,
And
but
that's the one that's, because I've not seen that, but that's the one that's like famous for being super sarcastic.
right, exactly, where the kids get to watch an ogre get a princess and sort of have a funny donkey, and parents get to watch this like incisive critique of fairy tales and human relations. And I don't feel like those levels ever meet. Like I think I'm not a fan of the Pixar films in the way that some people are, but I feel like what their genius was creating movies that adults liked and are moved by the same elements as kids liked and are moved by, as opposed to the Shrek films and some others around that time. And then they've continued throughout, where it's like existing at two planes simultaneously, one for the parents, one for the kids, in a way that Sesame Street does two planes simultaneously, one for the parents, one for the kids, where there's the Grover will be in a Mad Men spoof, where like he'll be wearing a fancy coat and like talking to ladies, and then the Mad Men music will play, and kids aren't supposed to get that. It's just so grown-ups can tolerate the experience of watching it. I wonder whether Randall Jarrell is doing like a total misguided, like insane poets version of that, where like the parents will love my jokes about poetic meter and rhyme and how it's missing 2 feet at the end of the iambic pentameter, where the kids will love animals because kids love animals. And like I don't think it's successful, because I don't think this is what kids love in animals, and I don't think grown-ups want to hear poetry analyzed by animals in their children's book. But I wonder if it was that same thought that like, I'm gonna give everyone everything and let the kids like kid stuff and grown-ups like grown-up stuff.
Yeah, it feels like a little bit like the story with F. Scott Fitzgerald was that when he was in Hollywood, he rather than doing what some novelists and screenwriters do, which is like just try to write novels and then sell them as screenplays, he like kind of overcompensated and was like, hey, I'm going to describe the shots in great detail, and it's going to be all
right. He wrote
I'm really going to write
for
the genre.
Screenplays. Yeah.
But it was like by trying to write to the genre, he even more failed the genre. This feels like a much more charming version, maybe, of that, where he is trying to do this. Like clearly, this is clearly meant both for adults and for children, but it ends up being sort of for neither. And yet, like I remembered reading it with a English as a second language kid in Baltimore with like the tutoring center over a couple of sessions, and it was like he got like 8% of it, and I thought like, oh, this is a surprisingly like not shitty thing for us to be reading out of this shitty book of stuff for kids to read.
But it is a funny idea. Like, what would be the ideal age for the kid, either to have this read to him or her, or to read it his or herself? Because
I don't know.
It's not for 5-year-olds, because it's not sweet or sort of fantastic in that way.
But like my daughter is 8, and she's like wolfing down Percy Jackson books, which are like trashy, like they're like written with all of the like psychological depth of like a 90s action movie, but they're not like there definitely are not. She would, I think, find this cloyingly sweet.
Exactly. No, that's what Owen, who read the first Percy Jackson and now is just can't stop with the Babysitters Club.
Oh,
And
right. Yeah.
who's going to date whom
Another
and how.
endless series of
It's just there are literally 131 books. Babysitters
in
Club
that one,
books.
they do have like multiple authors. Like Rick Riordan,
Yes.
like personally has written 130
Is that true?
books, but yeah, they're not all
Yeah.
Percy Jackson. But like he cranks them out.
So I don't think this is for anyone,
No.
which I guess is liberating in its way. Like I wish I could write something for nobody. Like there's something very like this couldn't exist now. Like nobody would publish this. You couldn't get a unless it was
you were famous enough.
If you were famous, you could.
Ada Limon could publish this.
That's probably true.
No, I think so. Like I think that's
right.
Brad Lighthouser published. Not actually. No, I'm sorry. Yeah, no, he did. He and his brother, who's an illustrator, they published an Abecedarian of poems. Which my guess is that it's like beautiful and really intricately made and charming and probably not for anybody. Is my assumption.
No, you're right. People can do this. It just needs to be a favor for them. It needs to be a passion project.
Richard Wilbur did his like dumb riddle books. Many of which were like explicitly kids' books.
I think we solved a philosophical or literary mystery, right?
Yeah,
I think we created it before solving it, but this is the origin of one of the most important pieces of mind-brain philosophical literature.
Yeah. And I think in this case, my dad might have been the least wrong of us.
Are you surprised? I mean, that was definitely.
Oh, like when he said it, I thought he was right. But I mean, often he has lots of objections that I don't think are right.
Yeah, no, that definitely seems right. And not only are you and I convinced by him, but I think Thomas Nagel and Randall Jarrell would agree with him too.